Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show where we make it as easy as possible for you to make the right choices to advance your podcasting career. So let's get started on the show. Why your 30-minute podcast episode actually takes 6 hours to produce, and most people quit after episode 3. Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show, and we have got a very special episode for you today because this is one that comes up all the time. How long does it take to produce the podcast? And what does that actually do to you when you realize how much is involved? Now, I will say there's lots of courses that are out there telling you how to produce a podcast. But sit back and think about this for a moment before we even get into this topic. When you are thinking about producing your own podcast, what is it doing in terms of taking you away from what your core area of expertise is? You've got to think about that, and that is exactly why most people don't get past episode 3. So let's just get into it a little bit further and talk about why these 30-minute podcasts really do take about 6 hours, because I want you to have a really good understanding of the reality of it. I don't want to discourage you from having a podcast. Far from that. I want you to have a podcast. In fact, if you are here, it's because you deserve to have a podcast. If it's in the back of your mind and you want to be a thought leader in business, then this is absolutely the opportunity for you. So, what we're going to do is talk to you about a few different things in the context of this, because there's a lot of areas to cover. So in the early research phase of podcasting, you were just talking about getting into a microphone, and then you start realizing about the editing software. And we've talked about some of those things in the past. And then you start talking about how long the episode is going to be. And then you start planning for the episode. You start getting this setup done. You start thinking about the post-production and the publishing, let alone if you start thinking about guests and conversations with other people. There's lots of things to think about in it. So I want you to be realistic about it and understand that diving in, it's not just a case of jumping onto Zoom, hitting record for 30 minutes, and then pressing a few buttons and out it goes out the door. The truth is that there is a time multiplier, particularly when it comes to editing. Expect that a 30-minute episode of your podcast is going to take you probably close to 2 hours, and initially maybe even longer, just for the editing phase. Now, of course, it depends on how proficient you get at editing over a period of time. It also depends on what tools you use and how much you rely on some of the AI. Now, word of warning, with a lot of the AI, it can take things out and do things that you maybe don't really want it to do. They are not perfect, far from it. And I think that spending a bit of time learning how they work, learning what you can take out yourself, often is a lot quicker than using the AI tools. That's just a little small tip for you. But then you've got to think about things as well. There is the pre-production side of things. You've got to be planning and researching what it is that you want to talk about in your episodes. Now, let's just assume that you've got past the early phases, I should say, where you've worked out what is this podcast going to be about, who is the target audience, what in fact are you going to call the podcast, have you got the graphics set up, have you got the various tools set up. We're going to assume that those things have happened because now you're in the recording phase. But there is this pre-production planning and research time that you do need. You need to think about what is the topic of conversation for this. Now, if you are trying to do an episode like this, where it's just you talking on your own, it's actually even harder. Because if you don't have the skill set, and look, I'm not going to say I'm perfect, far from it, but here's the thing. I've been doing this for, a few decades, let's just say. And it's not something that just happens naturally for most people. There are very few podcasters out there that do a great job in pulling off a simple episode where it is just them talking. It's hard. There's a lot that has to happen, and you don't want to be reading a script. I'm not reading a script now, And I don't recommend that you read a script, and we've done episodes about that in the past, so check them out if you haven't done already, about the pros and cons of scripting your podcast. The fact of the matter is you want it to be a conversation. Now, ideally, that conversation is happening with someone else. And again, this is a little shout out to the service that I offer, which is Podcast Done For You, which simply allows you to have a podcast with me where I'm your co-host. So you're having a conversation with me, and therefore it is so much easier to talk about what it is your area of expertise is, rather than trying to do it by yourself and have a conversation with someone who's not really there. And you can't really bounce off someone then and understand what the questions are that they might be asking. So you get past the pre-production and planning and research time that you need, and look, you might spend an hour on that once you get it down pat. Maybe you might spend a little bit less time on it. But then you've got all the technical setup and all the troubleshooting that goes alongside of all of that. You have to make sure you have all of that software set up and ready to go so that you can record. Now, most podcasters will tell you, as I have done in the past, as great as Zoom is for meetings, it is not the ideal tool for recording your podcast. Many reasons for that, but trust me, that is the case. So you want some software to be able to do that. Now, if you're going to have that software, it's going to require you to understand how it works, and you're going to have to understand troubleshooting. Things happen. I was recording a podcast just a day or two ago and realized that there was an echo on the line. Now, there were several people involved in this particular podcast, so stopping wasn't really an option. So in the end, I had to work out, how do we actually remove that echo in post-production? Well, we are able to do that. I'm not going to go into the technicalities of that now, but that's a good example of troubleshooting. There are other ways that if you do want to reduce some of those echo or get rid of it altogether while you're actually recording, those sorts of things you have to be aware of on how to do. They don't come straight forward to you unless you know and spend the time on it. Again, the question is, do you want to be spending that time on it? You want the podcast, but do you want all of this stuff with it? Post-production tasks, well, that's another big thing to worry about. You've got show notes that you have to be concerned about, clips for social media, and distributing those. Now, show notes is a big part of podcasts as well. You want a summary of what's happened. You want to put the chapters together for breaking up the podcast so people can jump around to things. You want to have content that you can drive people towards. So, for example, if you're interested in more information about the kinds of software that I use and recommend, and indeed recommendations for things like microphones and various other bits of equipment in the setup, then check out the show notes and you will be able to see a link to a page where you can download a copy of all of that information. Good example of what you put into the show notes. You spend a bit of time thinking about these things and getting the information right so that people who are scrolling through and deciding whether they want to listen to the podcast will quickly get a sense of what might be in it for them. So now let's get to the important points. Why 90% of podcasts don't make it past episode 7. And why, if you want to be in the top 1% of business podcasts, you just have to get past episode 20. I'll tell you why. It's very, very simple. All of these things accumulate. If you are spending 6 hours of your time on a podcast episode, what is the first thing that goes if a client comes knocking and asking you for information, asking you to do a project, if there's paid work coming in through the door? It's the podcast. Now, the problem is that you miss an episode or two and suddenly the value of the podcast flies out the window, and like many tasks that we have in life, it disappears. Sounds like a good idea at the time and you've forgotten about it. The trouble is the podcast is by far and away the best marketing tool that you could possibly have for your business. Again, not going to go into huge amounts of detail about that now because we've covered it in other episodes, but I will say this to you. Undoubtedly, this gives you way more than you can possibly even imagine right now, because it is not just about the podcast, it is about all the different ways that you distribute that content and utilize it. And when you sit down and work out how much time you are spending on writing posts for social media, for example, it is actually ultimately time efficient. But That is only the case if you don't have to worry about all these things that we're talking about today. Because the minute you start worrying about all of this stuff, the post-production, the pre-production, the things that are happening during the podcast, is where the time really kicks in, and where the potential for you to go, well, this is not really what I was here to do. This is not really what I want to deliver in my business. So what else is there to think about, and why you don't get past episode 7? Why? Again, the overwhelm. There are other things you have to think about. Keywords. That's right. Keywords comes into it as well. How long does podcast editing take is a good example of a keyword that we've hit upon for this particular episode. Podcast time investment, podcast production time, all of these things are keywords that come into just this particular episode that we're thinking about. It is all of these things that accumulate that really is why your 30-minute podcast episode actually really does take 6 hours to produce. And as I said, why most people quit after episode 3, and certainly by the time you get to episode 7, 90% have dropped out, and 99% have dropped out before you get to episode 20. Well, that's something that we take away completely. The most common thing that happens, really, when people like you are sitting there thinking about a podcast is the overwhelm. It is overwhelming. There are so much that you need to be thinking about. It is exactly why Podcast Done For You was established, so that it completely removes the overwhelm. All you have to do is show up and be the expert. We take care of everything else. Absolutely everything else. We'll even work with you on the topics that you need to cover in a particular episode, so you minimize the amount of time that you need even for thinking about it. The rest of it is all done for you completely, to the point where the co-hosting is the big factor. And we've talked about that specifically in previous episodes, but just to recap very particularly, it means that you are having a conversation with someone who is playing the part of your audience and is there solely to elevate you as an expert. And not only that, is someone who, in my particular case, is skilled of having worked in the media, worked as a journalist, worked as a producer, worked in communications and marketing for countless organizations and companies and small businesses as well. I know what I'm doing. I know how to elevate you. Now, that means that instead of 6 hours to produce a podcast that's only 30 minutes, all you have to do is show up for 30 minutes, record the podcast. We'll take care of everything else. In fact, for many of my clients, we compact it even more so we get maximize the value. But that's not the topic of conversation right now. That's something for you to think about and understand, that the 30-minute podcast episode that you really want to produce need not take you much more than 30 minutes, but you need to be prepared to ask for the support. You need to be prepared to say, this is a fantastic tool for my business. I want a podcast for all the right reasons. I want to be seen as a thought leader. I want to be the authority, the go-to person in my space for my business. I want an education and nurturing system for my business that podcasts produce. I just don't need to be the person that is doing everything. And I also want to warn you of one final trap that many have fallen into. They decide, okay, great, I'm going to outsource bits and pieces of this. Now let's put aside the fact that I've just established that the most important thing that you need to do is to have someone sitting in there to co-hosting with you. But everything else around it, don't think that you can just simply outsource that and not manage it, not have to have systems in place for how you think it should be. And again, that requires a whole lot of learning and a whole lot of additional resources that come at a cost, or it requires you diverting resources that you have from existing tasks that might be more up their alley of things that they should be doing for your business. So the moral of the story is, your podcast episode, it shouldn't take 6 hours to produce. You just need to talk to someone like us at Podcast Done For You. We are going to make sure that podcast editing is not a thing that you have to worry about. time investment for your podcast is minimized, and podcast production time is zero from your point of view. So when you come and ask me that question, how long does podcast editing take? It's irrelevant. What is the podcast time investment? It is as long as the episode is that you want to create. And we will make that as efficient as possible for you, so it's not even a question of allocating a certain amount of time every week. We will bulk record a bunch of episodes, so we minimize the time that you lose from being in the business, maximize the outcomes that you get from having a podcast. So as I said, all of those things taken care of. So have a good think about it. If you've made it to the end, thank you for listening in. And I do hope you subscribe to Podcasts Done For You, the show, wherever you are listening or watching this on YouTube. Make sure you never miss an episode. And we'd love to have your likes and comments in there. If you've got an idea for a topic you want us to cover, by all means, let me know. All the details in the show notes of how to get in contact with me. And as I said, good luck on your podcast journey. I'd love to help you with it. So do use the links in the show notes to reach out to me, book an appointment, and let's have a free chat and see if Podcasts Done For You can be of assistance in making you the thought leader you deserve to be.